does seem like Europe has become increasingly secular. In America, are countries that are scientifically literate will succeed, and those who are not scientifically literate become failed states. Due to that competition, so economic success, do you think that will force creationism to become retired in the graveyard of bad ideas?
One would like to think so. And evolution is economically important. This is something that we do well to realize. Applications in medicine and biotechnology, practically by definition. When you think about the broader creationist assault on science, like a young Earth creationist now, consider petroleum geology. Is this a good field for young Earth creationists? Apparently not. There's a geologist who had a degree from Institute for Creation Research, went into petroleum geology, found that what he had learned was completely useless and that he had to go by mainstream geology to get his job done. He talked to his fellow colleagues who were graduates of the ICR graduate school. They all felt the same way, and there was widespread fall away from young Earth creationists by people who actually had to use geology on the job.
There was a creationist who was trying to get investors for a petroleum company for his theory that Israel was floating atop an ocean of undiscovered oil, and it was being promoted on Christian radio. I can't remember his name right now, but it was a couple of years ago. They were making a lot of noise on it on one of the Sacramento Christian stations.
Wow.
I guess it hasn't paid off.
If you remember the details, I'd be very interested in.
I had heard that the park rangers in the Grand Canyon were prohibited from telling the age of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, that's
what was the status of that?
That's false. So what happened? There is a group called Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, which is generally a good group and did a lot of work against Bush-era assaults on the scientific integrity of the National Park Services, among other things. But they put this false claim in a press release. It was false, then it retracted. That said, there have been problems at the NPS. The big one basically involves the presence of a young Earth creationist coffee table book about the Grand Canyon, beautiful photographs, that was being sold at the bookstores in the Grand Canyon. Now you might think, well, wait a minute, the government doesn't own those bookstores. It doesn't. Something called the Grand Canyon Association owns those bookstores. But it does become a problem because those bookstores and their inventory is overseen and approved by the National Park Service. And so, that kind of removes it from its private and creationists that can do what they want, even if we don't have to like it, to we have a serious problem of government endorsement of creationism. So that situation never really got straightened out very nicely. A lot of people protested, including the presidents of something like 8 professional geoscience societies. The buck kept on getting handed off to different people in the NPS, and really there was never any clear explanation of why those books were let in when they clearly didn't pass the criteria for scientific accuracy generally expected of books being sold in the regular bookstores. So I don't really have a happy ending trip there. I do not presently know whether they're getting sold.
Can you comment on California textbooks and their quality in this area?
Yeah. Well, everyone always complains about textbooks, and there's plenty to complain about. The general trend over the last few years has been improvement in the accuracy of the treatment of evolution textbooks. It's still not all it could be. The treatment generally needs to be deeper, it needs to be more pervasive, it needs to be more up-to-date and more exciting. California, in the early 90s, had some big fights over textbooks. Recently, we haven't really had those fights, which is good. California is one of the big textbook markets in the United States, although Texas may be bigger. And I believe that due to budget reasons, California is not doing textbook approval in the immediate future, so we're not going to fight. Texas is where you really have more of a problem. You have a 15-person school board there, which is elected, of whom 7 are creationists, with maybe 1 swing vote and a number of people who, though not creationists, are, shall we say, too easily swayed. So Texas recently did a hatchet job on its state's science standards. And you have to wonder, here you are, your State Board of Education, you've got a Department of Education. The Department of Education goes out and recruits teachers and scientists to spend time devising a set of state science standards, which are basically guidelines. It's not as detailed as a curriculum or a lesson plan. These are guidelines about what students ought to learn, without exactly explaining how they learn them. So you have all these experts on science, experts on pedagogy, developing the standards in a collaborative process over the course of months. And then you give them to a board of education led by a creationist dentist, and you just let them rewrite them ad lib without any consultation and enshrine them as part of your state's administrative apparatus. They're going to, eventually, they're not going to be able to get anybody to write the standards if that's the way they're going to treat them.
Welcome to Alice in Wonderland.
Yes?
What about in the classroom? I can't recall a single time that anybody walked into the classroom and actually regulated what the teacher was saying. I mean, I know there's curriculum, but what's going on to ensure that the teachers who are teaching these things are actually teaching?
Well, that's where you have the extreme decentralization of American education at play. Even if you have evolution front and center in your state's science standards, still, when the classroom door closes, it's basically up to the teacher whether evolution is allowed or not. Now, there are increasingly some more constraints on this. One is, interestingly, thanks to President Bush, who enacted, signed into law, No Child Left Behind in 2002. What this does is set up it basically requires states to have state science standards and to have high-stakes testing. Now, state science standards started emerging in, say, the early 90s, but No Child Left Behind really cemented their importance. So what happens now is if you have evolution in standards, then you're going to have evolution in the state testing. If you have it in the state testing, you're going to have it in the classroom, because otherwise your students aren't going to do as well, and there are going to be consequences for your school. Is it any wonder that some of the nastiest fights we've had over evolution education in the last decade have been over the place of evolution in state science standards? Creationists understand these connections too, and that's why we have had big fights in Kansas and Texas and Ohio and New Mexico and West Virginia over the place of evolution in state science standards. When you get a competent group of scientists and educators to write a list of things that students need to know and be able to do, you'll have evolution in there. But if you have politicians in the mix, especially ones with creationist constituencies, then you have trouble. So generally, when a new law comes across my desk, and we went to evolution law, my reaction is, oh, new law, that's exciting. But when a new standards fight comes up, I say, okay, all hands on deck, because that's going to be more of a fight. A lot of creationist legislation is really, I think, introduced to score points with constituents and not in the serious expectation that it's going to pass. The fights over standards are really serious. I should say, having deprecated the importance of fights over legislation, that we did have that creationist bill pass in Louisiana in 2008, so they're not all duds, but most of them are.